Hi, I'm Paul Jay. Welcome to the Analysis.news. In just a few seconds, I'll be back with my guest, Nader Hashemi. We're going to, of course, discuss Iran and the war between Israel and Iran and the United States, what Trump wants us to call the 12-day war. That's because history always starts from wherever Donald Trump says it does. Be back in just a few seconds. So joining me now to discuss the war against Iran is Nader Hashemi. He's an associate professor of Middle East Studies and Islamic Politics and director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thanks for joining us, Nader.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So Nader, the ceasefire is on. Trump is doing victory laps supposedly at the NATO meetings. And to some extent, I think you'd have, in my opinion, it seems it is somewhat of a win for Trump for now. I don't know how long any of this lasts. It also does seem a bit of a win for Israel if you look through the world through their eyes. Although the supreme leader in Iran declared victory. But who should be declaring victory here in your mind, and what's your take on the whole situation?
I can understand why Trump and Netanyahu are taking a victory lap. I think clearly, if one looks at, who came out better on the other side, it's the Israeli and the Americans. Iran, in many ways, revealed itself to be a paper tiger in terms of its military preparedness. It was completely taken aback by this attack. Most of Iran's senior military leaders were assassinated. Many of its top nuclear scientists. Iran didn't even have an air defense system that could protect its own skies. The Israelis and the Americans had almost complete access. Much of Iran's, nuclear program has sustained serious hits. We don't know how big of a hit it is. There's reports saying that the American strike on the nuclear facilities have been very limited. It's only pushed it back a few months. I just saw a report from the head of the International Atomic Energy Association, a man by the name of Rafael Grossi, saying that no, the damage is actually quite significant. So at least in the short term, it looks like Iran now is a much weaker state in terms of its overall military potential, and that they sustained a major hit. But I think, what's going to happen from this moment is a series of events have been now unleashed that there's no stopping. And that's going to, I think, fundamentally undermine the American and Israeli position. And I'm speaking specifically about the predictable response from the Iranian regime now is going to fast track and incentivize them to prepare and obtain a nuclear weapon. They're going to make the case that, look, that's the only way we can protect our national security. This event, that's the major takeaway. And they'll have a lot of public support to do so because there's a perception, at least among many Iranians, even those that despise the regime, is that their national territorial integrity and independence has been severely jeopardized by these series of events over the last 10 days. So that's not a net gain for Israel or the United States. Also, the talk of regime change, I think, if one looks at it, has actually emboldened the Iranian regime. And clearly, in my view, as someone who studied internal Iranian politics very closely, it's actually weakened the internal prospects for democracy and human rights from within the human rights community in Iran. That's not a net gain for the Americans and the Israelis. So, and then finally, the point that I think is, one of the big takeaways is the biggest loser here is international law and what's left of the so-called rules-based.
That was my next question.
Yeah, rules-based order, because now it's just a laughing joke. I mean, it always was on tenterhooks with, U.S. policy in Gaza and European policy with respect to the horror show in Gaza, the contrast between Gaza and Ukraine. But, if 3 weeks from now or a month from now, China decides to invade and occupy Taiwan, claiming they're posing a national security threat, the West doesn't have a moral leg to stand on. So in many ways, we are in this new Hobbesian world, rule of the jungle, where the UN Charter, the rules of the international system that countries such as Canada, at least theoretically, used to pay lip service to, no longer really exists. And you saw that most dramatically when even at the G7 summit and the European countries, including the Canadian government, effectively adopted a position that was strongly supportive of the Israeli military attack on Iran, blaming Iran effectively for this crisis, and saying things that were just completely ridiculous, that Iran had to return to the negotiating table when they were at the negotiating table and the Israelis blew it up. I think the long-term repercussions of this does not bode well for American and Israeli interests, and certainly not for the interests of those of us who believe in a more just and equitable rules-based order.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that there's no good guys on any side of this if you're talking about at the government ruling circle level, uh, and that includes the Iranians. But what the Israelis have done in terms of crimes against humanity, and what the United States has done, which even surpasses the Israelis, and of course the Israelis couldn't have done what they did in Gaza or in Lebanon without the United States. But whatever crimes the Iranian state has committed, and it certainly has, they don't come close to the crimes of the Israelis in the United States. So there's no good guys here. But the way the media covers this is it's all about state versus state. It's ruling circles versus ruling regimes. The people who have been attacked here are the Iranian people, and the Iranian, one of the principles of international law is not collective punishment, but that's exactly what's going on here. They don't like what Iran did in terms of supporting Hamas and Hezbollah, but it's the Iranian people that are paying the price. So dig into more of this whole issue of, in terms of international law, what's at stake here.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that characterization. Both the Iranian regime and the Israelis are nasty regimes. The old argument used to be that, well, Israel, even though it has a massive nuclear arsenal, it could be trusted to behave in a responsible way because the nature of that regime was not as draconian and as, horrific as its adversaries. But now, if you just compare the human rights record of the Islamic Republic with the human rights record of the State of Israel, um, there's not a lot to admire there. I mean, now we're talking about a Netanyahu government that is, widely viewed around the world by the human rights community as presiding over an apartheid state. Now it's a genocidal state, and has nuclear weapons, and it has support of many Western governments. While the Iranian regime is brutal, authoritarian, repressive, executes more people than any other country in the world after China. And they're told that they can't have a nuclear weapon. So when you look at it from a human rights perspective, there's not a lot there to admire on either side. And so when it comes to international law, it's clear that what we're seeing here is we're being exposed to, I think, a great teaching moment in terms of how international law is selectively invoked by great powers when it serves their interest, and they just throw it away when it doesn't serve their interest. This sort of gung-ho sort of support from the European Union, from Canada, in support of this Israeli attack on Iran, which was a clear violation of the UN Charter, the rules of the international system, clearly an act of aggression based on concocted sort of evidence that no one believes existed in terms of Iran, about to have a nuclear weapon, thus necessitating an Israeli strike. All of those, arguments and principles that we saw that the West invoked so passionately when it came to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, claiming that we had to stand up for this rules-based order, we had to condemn aggression, we had to oppose occupation, we had to go after war criminals. And then, Gaza happens, and all of those principles are tested. And the same countries who were speaking with such robust certainty about the sanctity of international law, throw those principles away when it comes to the Palestinians, and then again in the context of Iran. So what it does is it actually creates a big fissure. It widens the chasm between the global north and the global south. In North America, what I'm talking about doesn't resonate in terms of mainstream media analysis. There's just an assumption that, look, the Middle East is ours, and we're going to support our friends, and we're going to go after our adversaries. And some countries in the Middle East can have nuclear weapons. In other words, our allies, and our adversaries can't. And if they try to do it, we're going to bomb them. And that's the way the system works. But in the global south, people see the hypocrisy, see the double standards, see see how this looks like and smacks of another sort of 19th century imperialist moment, where the West and its allies are just going to use their military muscle to impose their will on parts of the world that they view as an adversary. And so I think fundamentally what's happening today, and I wrote about this in my Guardian piece a few days ago, the fundamental reason why I think the bombing of Iran happened is because Iran in the Middle East represents a country that has an independent foreign policy separate from the great powers. And when I mean it's an independent foreign policy, I don't mean it's a good foreign policy, but it's separate. It works outside of the orbit of Western interests. And it has challenged American and Israeli interests in the region. And now Iran is very weak because of its losses in Lebanon primarily and in Syria. And now there's a sense that we can take this regime down if we just hit it hard enough. And I think that's fundamentally, that explains the why now question. There's a sense of, having defeated Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now that the Assad regime is gone, if Israel were to just now expand its reach and defeat its one regional adversary, it could establish full hegemony over the Middle East. The West, of course, has backed that works with Western interests. And so that explains, I think, why the West is behaving in this way with respect to this conflict. And it also explains the double standards that we're seeing.
So I think most of our viewers know what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, just because it needs to get said. It doesn't, in mainstream media, you don't hear what we're talking about very often. The only reason Iran doesn't have, quote, a right to enrich uranium at almost nuclear weapon levels, the only reason Iran doesn't have a right to build a nuclear bomb is because it signed the non-proliferation agreement and said it wouldn't. Otherwise, it has every right, as much as Israel, the United States, or any other country, to have a nuclear weapon. So the way this whole thing gets reported on is somehow there's some underlying reason in terms of international law other than a treaty that Iran voluntarily signed and can voluntarily leave anytime they want and have chosen not to. Number two, there was no imminent threat. They didn't have a nuclear weapon. Nobody, neither Israel or Trump, is saying they've got one. And they more or less admit it isn't imminent in the way within weeks or days or something. They try to say that, but everyone knows it's nonsense. And under international law, if the threat isn't imminent, you've got no right for some kind of preemptive strike. So even on CNN, you can hear people say there was no right under international law, nor was there, even in terms of American law, a right to declare war without an act of Congress. Okay, all that being said, let me just even say again, the criminal Israeli regime, because if we're going to call Iran a regime, I might as well call Israel one too, and you might as well say that about the United States too. So let's call them all governments for now. Mm-hmm. All that being said, why the heck was Iran enriching at 60%, assuming they were? I don't think they've denied it. I think it's pretty well clear that they were. And it makes me think this is a bit like Saddam before the invasion of Iraq, where he was bluffing about having a nuclear weapons program. All the inspectors said he didn't have one. Everyone that knew anything for real knew he didn't have a weapons nuclear plan or a biological weapons plan. All the UN inspectors were saying so. But for some insane bravado, Saddam was bluffing that he did. And why on earth he thought that would work, but it helped feed the argument of the Americans that there was some justification for the invasion. This almost feels something similar to me. Like, why enrich at 60%? And, I see Mark Rubio on TV, and as much I can't stand Mark Rubio and I can't stand the Trump foreign policy and so on, it's not a bad question. Why are you enriching at 60%? Why are you shoving it in some mountain? If it's really for making medical isotopes, which is the only possible reason to go beyond 4 or 5%, what's needed for nuclear power, you don't need all these shenanigans to make some isotopes.
Right. It's a great question. I think we need to just roll back the clock a bit and just understand how this all evolved. Recall that in 2015, Iran struck a nuclear agreement with the West, principally the United States. It was called the JCPOA. It's widely viewed as one of the most significant and comprehensive arms control agreement ever negotiated. The world effectively celebrated that event. There was talk of a Nobel Peace Prize for the Secretary of State John Kerry and his counterpart, Javad Zarif, the Iran foreign minister. Iran put its nuclear program basically under international inspection, rolled everything back. Things were moving forward. In 2018, Donald Trump tears up the agreement at the encouragement of Israel and its allies in Congress. And then Iran still, for 1 year later, adheres to the agreement. And then it starts to enrich uranium at 20%, then at 60%. It was doing that, I think, primarily as leverage to get sanctions lifted. That's the key, I think, incentive and motive here. Iran had given up its whole enrichment program, and under the terms of the nuclear agreement of 2015, agreed to keep it at very low levels just for nuclear energy under 4%. So that, I think, explains, that's an answer to the Marco Rubio question: why are you doing this at 60%? And I think Iran was always
hold
willing
on,
to
so let's be
compromise.
clear. So, because supposedly it gives them leverage in negotiations, when in reality, it seems to me, it makes them a target.
Yeah, well, that was the risk they were playing, right? Because their bluff was called, right? Because Rubio pointed out, why are you doing this? You must be wanting a nuclear weapon. So, I mean, that's the only leverage they had. Iran doesn't have many cards to play, but I think it was constantly using the threat that it's going to keep enriching uranium. It's going to get close to a nuclear weapons grade material, but it never really crossed that line. So it was playing a very risky game because I think it had very few cards to play. Yeah, and I think the other element here is that Iran wanted to produce a nuclear weapons program so it could be, in a moment of crisis, at a situation where it would be a nuclear threshold state, that if ever there was an existential threat to the regime, that it would have the capacity and the infrastructure to quickly move toward a nuclear weapon as a last resort to save the regime in this case. I think that was very much the calculation, which explains why they've invested so heavily for such a long time in building this extensive nuclear program. They gave it up in 2015 because they had to in order to get a deal to have sanctions lifted. And then they started to go back to what they were planning when Trump tore up the agreement and started to impose heavy sanctions on Iran. So this is the game that the regime was playing. But now all of that is yesterday's news. As I said earlier in our conversation, I think the proponents within Iran, the hardliners, are going to now make a very convincing case, and they're going to have much more public support than they did before, that the recent attack leaves Iran with no other choice but to try and develop a nuclear weapon.
But that's going to be crazy.
Yeah.
Now the American, Israel will bomb Iran with impunity anytime they feel like it. If they get the slightest win that there's another nuclear program going on, they'll be worse than it was before. Like I just don't get the entire thing. Makes no sense to me. I think they did have a choice not to do it before. They claim they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
If you want to do it, then bloody do it. Get out of the non-proliferation agreement.
Yeah.
And go for it.
Well, that's what actually they're doing. If you're following the recent news, the Iran's parliament, which is very much rubber stamp parliament, they passed legislation to sort of suspend their relationship with the International Atomic Energy Association, and there's talk of pulling out of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. I agree, it's high risk, but I think the other option is to simply adhere to what Donald Trump has said explicitly: unconditional surrender, to sort of give up its nuclear program. And for the Iranian regime and for segments of society, it's a source of national pride. They've invested heavily in it. They make the arguments that we were just talking about a moment ago. Why can Israel have a nuclear weapons program? Why can Pakistan have a nuclear weapons program? Why can't we? And so this is going to be a big internal debate. And I agree, it could invoke another military assault on their program. But I think one of the key lessons, that this moment teaches countries, including Iran, is that, if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you'll be subjected to this type of intimidation and bombing. Look at North Korea. North Korea had developed a nuclear program. They can't be touched in this way. Look what happened to Libya. Libya had a nuclear program. It gave it up because the West wanted it to give it up. And when the moment of truth came and the regime was about to fall, they had no cards to play. And in fact, there was a very famous statement that Iran's supreme leader made at that time when Gaddafi was toppled. And he basically said, I'm summarizing, but I remember it very well. He was saying, Muammar Gaddafi, you stupid idiot, look what you did to yourself. You gave up your nuclear program because the West gave you these assurances. And now in your moment of need, you have nothing to protect yourself. So I think that's going to be one of the big takeaways. And yes, it is high risk. It is stupid. But I think, this is the big debate in Iran right now. There's going to be
let me
pushback.
say, yeah, well, I think it's not high risk. I think it's suicidal, but I think there's a reason why it's suicidal. And tell me if you think I'm right. Like almost, I think for every country, foreign policy starts with domestic politics. And it's been true for the United States, and it's true. Half of the Cold War had nothing to do with a real Soviet military threat, which they knew there wasn't one, but it was part of the narrative of the anti-communist campaign and the campaign against socialists and progressives and trade unions in the United States, and as part of a narrative to impose a global hegemony of U.S. capital. But in Iran, the narrative that this government, but I'll say regime because we go beyond the government, it's all the religious and political and Revolutionary Guard and all this whole architecture. Their raison d'etre, their justification is that they're the defender of the faith, they're the defender against the great Satan, they're the defender against imperialism, they're the leader of the resistance, as much as a lot of that is not true, but still. Some of it, I guess, to some extent, as you said, they do have a foreign policy that the United States doesn't like, and that's a sin in American eyes. But in terms of what I'm asking, in terms of Iranian domestic politics, the class struggle in Iran, where there's a very, very wealthy elite, and much of the country lives in poverty. And the working class is suppressed, and unions are illegalized, and women and women's rights are suppressed. It's a very sharp class struggle, and I think it's very similar to Israel. I was at a film festival in Israel about 25 years ago or something, and someone told me, if it wasn't for the Palestinian struggle, and at that time there wasn't terrorist attacks going on at the time I was there, but it wasn't that far back. What I was told was, if there wasn't an existential threat from the Palestine question, from the Palestinian struggle, there'd be civil war in Israel between the secular and the Orthodox. And there's the same thing, same issue in Iran. If Iran doesn't have this existential threat of Israel and doesn't have the existential threat of the West, how does class struggle in Iran evolve? Like, don't they need this super enemy just as much as the Israelis do?
No, I would agree with that framing, which is one reason why I was such a big proponent of the nuclear agreement in 2015, because it sort of diminished the international hostility and context that enveloped Iran up until that point. It sort of removed the threat of an external attack, which then created better internal conditions for the forces of democracy in Iran to sort of coalesce themselves. Also, sanctions would be lifted, and that would give people purchasing power where they weren't sort of struggling to survive day to day, which would allow them to better mobilize. So that was my primary reason why I was so supportive of that nuclear agreement, because it would have positive consequences within Iran for those progressive forces. I don't think the Iranian regime, obviously they benefit from this external context, but it's also a risky game for them because they don't want to push things to the point where there's regime instability and the regime faces an external sort of crisis, as we've just seen. So they're playing sort of a very careful game. But I think what we're seeing right now at this moment is this attack is allowing the regime to do several things. One, to have what's called this rally around the flag effect, where people who, even if they hate the regime, they're upset over how Israel has so brutally, attacked Iran and killed mostly civilians. That's point number one. The regime is also using this national security crisis to round up people in the name of going after these Mossad agents and to silence any and all critics. I'm just reading reports today that, there's been 6 executions over the last couple of days. Prisoners are being sort of moved around to create more room in Evin prison. And that's, I think, going to be an opportunity for the regime to say, look, we're in full control now. Anyone who dissents on any of our policies, you're going to wind up in jail. So, this is something we've seen before when there's a national security crisis. Repressive regimes take full advantage to sort of consolidate their control. So that's playing itself out, and it's going to have negative consequences and connotations also for the Iranian people. They don't have a lot of choices. I think the Iranian people, I've often described them as caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, they're living under a brutal authoritarian regime that has a lot of repression and is willing to sort of use a lot of bloodshed to stay in power. And then on the other side, they're caught between the West and its sanctions and U.S. foreign policy that really has never really, I think, been interested in supporting the forces of democracy in Iran. They've all been really interested in just containing Iran's regional outreach, Iran's challenge to America's allies in the region, not really trying to take the question of democracy seriously. And so the prospects don't look good for the Iranian people. They don't have a lot of choices and options to work with as well. And so it's a very dark picture. I'm very skeptical that this moment is going to, unlike what some people believe in the West, that regime collapse is imminent, and maybe if Israel just would have continued bombing a bit more, this would have led to the collapse of the regime. No, that's not what's going to happen. It's going to actually have the opposite effect. It's going to strengthen the regime and actually probably continue its shelf life because of the points that I just made.
I'll give you another possible way this goes. And I don't know this is Trump. He's got some smart people around him. I think probably the biggest objective of the Americans right now is and should be from a point of view of American imperialism, from their point of view, is to pry Iran away from China as much as they can. It's very difficult because they put Iran in the situation that I think it's 94% of their oil goes to China. But if they can actually tell the Iranians you can come back and do business again in the West, and you can, it's in American interest to keep this government, keep this class in power in 2 ways. Trump made an interesting comment on the airplane on his way to the NATO meetings. They said, "Are you for regime change?" And instead of saying, "Well, it may happen, it may not, it's not up to us, da da da," someone talked to him and he got the point. He said, "No, because it will lead to chaos." And I think most people don't understand how easy it would be for Iran to become what happened to Iraq. What is it? 30–40% of Iran, if I have my numbers right, is Sunni. Even if the majority is Shia, there is so much opportunity for a brew of fishing in troubled waters, of civil war. If this government fell in the state of kind of collapse, not because there was a movement ready to take over, but it just falling into factions and fighting, it could be real chaos in terms of post Saddam Iraq. Am I right about that?
No, you're right. The figures of Sunni Shia are a bit different than the one you stated. It's about maybe 10%.
Correct me, please.
Yeah, but you're actually absolutely accurate in terms of the possibility of the breakup of Iran, specifically along a more ethnic line. So the Kurds can, the United States would have, and they've already, I think, planned to sort of, pry the Kurdistan region out of Iran, out of Iran's control. There's been a separatist movement among the Arabic-speaking province of Khuzestan in the south, and also in the Pakistani border. The Baluch community has been persecuted and discriminated against. So this, if the central regime collapsed or was weakened, and I think there's actually been discussion of this in right-wing circles in the United States and in Israel, that this is one way of pressing forward, is to precisely try and weaken Iran that way. So these are very much options, and then it would lead to the type of chaos that you're talking about that would make, I think, in many ways, Iraq look like a picnic, because Iran is a much bigger state and has a greater population, huge refugee flows. I mean, even if 1% of Iran's, even if 0.1% of Iran's 90 million people were to become refugees. That's 900,000 people moving into Europe, with huge destabilizing consequences. So, yeah, so things could get bad very quickly, and have huge regional destabilization consequences. Um,
Yeah, I
the
mean, see,
thing,
I don't think the Israelis give a damn if that happens.
oh, I know, I think that's
But
very
it's
much
not
their
good for the
goal.
Americans. It's not good for
Yeah,
the for Europe, as you say. It's not good for anybody really, other than
I agree.
some
I agree. The thing
insane
about
people in
Trump,
Tel Aviv.
yeah, the thing about Trump, you're right. Trump, see, what was so shocking about this attack and America's support for Trump's support for the Israeli attack was that up until the day of the attack, Trump was actually talking about diplomacy. He was actually even saying things about, the possibility of, economic relations, and that was being reciprocated in Iran as well. That we could perhaps even see American companies coming and investing again, which is one reason why everyone was so shocked by the attack, because everything seemed to be pointing in the direction of diplomacy and accommodation. But I think the problem here is that Trump is so inexperienced and seems to make big decisions based on the last person that he's spoken to, that, it looks like he's moving in one direction, then all of a sudden he does the opposite. And we've seen that in the last few days where, just recall what Trump said after the Americans bombed the nuclear facilities in Iran. He gave that sort of statement in the White House with Rubio and Hegseth on his side, sounding really sort of, determined, praising Netanyahu, talking about, if Iran sort of popped its head up again, we're going to hit it hard. And then the next day, he's sort of criticizing Netanyahu and blaming Israel for not adhering to the ceasefire, and talking about, how we're going to bring these two sides together. And Iran fought really bravely. And, it's almost as if he's bipolar, this man. And the tragedy here is that, he's the president of the most powerful country in the world. And when he has that type of, influence and impact, someone who's so erratic and unpredictable, it has these types of destabilizing consequences. You literally don't know what he's going to do next.
Well, I
And I
think
think
it's
this,
because he's got two different voices. He's got a little devil on this ear. He's got on this shoulder. He's got another one here. Over here, he's got the traditional neocon Cold Warrior mentality, which is
Mhm.
support for Israel is a key component of that Cold War style. And then he's got the new Cold Warriors. And the new Cold Warriors, it's all about China.
Mhm.
And anything you can do to weaken China, because the
Yeah.
whole coming war with China. So, you can imagine if someone wants to completely destabilize Iran, you get the Baluch, which is a big section of Pakistan that's very persecuted. They have tons of resources, and they're right near the big port that the Chinese have invested tons of money in. And there's a section of Baluch people that live on the Iranian side of the border, but they really are against the Chinese. So there's all kinds of potential levers to create different fractions of civil war. Whereas if the Americans can get the Iranians to say, listen, you really are about, you want to make lots of money, you want to have some respect in the world. Well, how about you try it this way? We'll let you back into the global economy. We'll pry you away from China. You keep your theocracy. Look, we get along with the Saudis. We don't care about theocratic dictatorships. We do very well with them.
Mhm.
And kind of allow the Iranians back in. And it seems to me if the theocracy in Iran can figure out a way to explain that to the Iranian people, maybe they go that route.
Yeah.
And then maybe the Israelis really don't like that, because then you have a kind of powerful opponent. Even if it's partly more in the Western camp, it's still not going to
Yeah.
be something Israel likes.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. That's where the way things were headed. I think because of this crisis, it's going to be very difficult for anyone in Iran, particularly among the senior hardline leadership, to make the case that we can trust the Americans again after what they're going to perceive as a series of betrayals. Yeah, we can strike these deals and move in that direction, but how do we know Trump's not going to pull out again and listen to the person, the analogy that you used, the voice on his right side, sort of whispering in his ear. So that's a new challenge that I think is going to have to be overcome. I don't think it can be overcome that easily. And so we're going to have to watch how all of this plays out.
Give me just another final little sentence about just a little message to Americans and Canadians, how they should think about this, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a very dark moment. I think this is a turning point for the politics of the Middle East, Yeah, Iran is weaker and the United States and Israel seem to have won, but I think this war, 12-day war, is going to unleash a series of unintended consequences that's not going to lead to regime stability or regional stability in the Middle East, but more instability as Iran tries to figure out, what it wants to do with its nuclear program and how it wants to proceed in response to these events that we're talking about. So I think this story is just beginning. It's not by any ways over.
Great. Thanks very much for joining us, Nader.
Great.
And thank
Thanks,
you for
Paul.
joining us on theAnalysis.news. Don't forget that there's a donate button. We can't do this without you. And most importantly, sign up for our email list because YouTube and some of the other platforms are clearly suppressing what we do. But if you get on the email list, you'll know what we're up to. Thanks again.